The most feared man in New York changed my life because I asked him to remove his watch. It was past midnight when they rushed him into the emergency room. Rain hammered against the hospital windows. Nurses moved quickly. Doctors shouted instructions. And there he was, sitting calmly on a hospital bed with a cut above his eyebrow and a watch worth more than my entire apartment. "I need you to take that off before treatment," I told him. The man looked at me for a second. Then he smiled and handed it over without argument. I had no idea who he was. To me, he was just another patient. For the next 30 minutes, I cleaned his wound, checked his vitals, and made sure he was stable. He watched me the entire time. Not in a strange way. More like he was trying to understand something. When he left, I forgot about him. Or at least I thought I did. The next week, he came back for a follow-up appointment he probably did not need. Then another. Then another. Every visit gave him one more excuse to talk to me. One afternoon, he saw me buying lunch for a homeless patient who had nowhere else to go. Something changed in his eyes that day. Then everything changed in mine. Because that night, I learned the truth. The quiet man from the emergency room was Ethan Romano. The ruthless boss everyone in the city feared. I should have walked away. Instead, I listened. I listened as he told me about growing up poor. About losing people he loved. About becoming someone he barely recognized. Weeks later, I found myself standing in the middle of a storm I never expected. People wanted to use me to pressure him. So I left. I thought it would protect him. But when Ethan finally found me again, he had already sacrificed something priceless. Not money. Not power. Something bigger. Then he looked at me and asked one question. Was it worth losing everything if it meant keeping you safe? And that was the moment I realized I still did not know how far he was willing to go. The most dangerous people are not the ones who threaten your life. They are the ones who change it forever. The night I met Ethan Romano began like every other overnight shift at St. Vincent Medical Center in Manhattan. Rain hammered against the emergency room windows. Ambulances arrived one after another. Doctors moved quickly through crowded hallways. Monitors beeped endlessly. It was nearly 11 o'clock when the doors opened again. 2 men entered with a patient between them. At first, nothing seemed unusual. He appeared calm. Composed. Dressed better than anyone I had ever seen in the emergency room. A dark tailored coat rested across his shoulders. His expensive watch caught the fluorescent light overhead. Even sitting down, he carried himself like someone used to being obeyed. I grabbed a clipboard and walked toward him. "Name?" I asked. His blue eyes met mine. "Ethan." His voice was low and controlled. "Last name?" A slight smile appeared. "Romano." The name meant nothing to me. I wrote it down without hesitation. One of the men beside him looked surprised. Almost confused. As if people normally reacted differently. I ignored it. "I need to examine you." Ethan nodded. While preparing supplies, I noticed his watch again. It looked impossibly expensive. More valuable than anything I had ever owned. "Please remove your watch before treatment." One of the men beside him shifted uncomfortably. Ethan simply looked at me for a second before unclasping it and placing it in my hand. Of course. No argument. No attitude. Just cooperation. That surprised me. Most wealthy patients were difficult. Ethan was not. I cleaned a small cut above his eyebrow and checked his vitals. Everything appeared normal. Throughout the entire process, he watched me carefully. Not in an uncomfortable way. More like he was studying something he did not understand. Finally I looked up. "What?" Another small smile touched his face. "Nothing. You have been staring for 10 minutes. Have I?" "Yes." The smile grew slightly. Then I apologize. I shook my head and continued working. Something about him felt different. Not dangerous. Not arrogant. Different. The strange feeling stayed with me even after his treatment ended. Before leaving, Ethan stood and reached for his watch. "Thank you, Claire." I blinked. "How do you know my name?" He glanced toward my identification badge. Lucky guess. For the first time, I laughed. A genuine laugh after an exhausting shift. Something flickered across his expression when he heard it. Something warm. Then he left. I expected never to see him again. Patients came and went every day. That was part of the job. But 3 days later, Ethan Romano returned. Officially, he was there for a follow-up examination. Unofficially, I had a feeling that was not the real reason. When I walked into the examination room and saw him sitting there waiting, his blue eyes immediately lifted toward mine. The same calm expression. The same strange focus. "Good evening, Claire." A small knot formed unexpectedly in my stomach. "Mr. Romano." His smile appeared again. "Ethan." Looking back now, that simple correction changed everything. Because I still did not know who Ethan Romano really was. I did not know his name carried weight throughout the city. I did not know powerful people feared disappointing him. I did not know entire rooms became silent when he entered. All I knew was that a patient I barely knew had returned to see me again. And for reasons I could not explain, I was glad he had. Some people enter your life quietly. Then somehow they become impossible to ignore. Ethan Romano returned to the hospital 3 times over the next 2 weeks. Officially, every visit had a perfectly reasonable explanation. A follow-up examination. A routine consultation. A minor concern that required professional advice. Unofficially, even I knew something strange was happening. The first time, I assumed it was coincidence. The second time, I became suspicious. By the third visit, I was almost certain. Ethan found reasons to return because he wanted to see me. The realization should have made me uncomfortable. Instead, it made me curious. One evening near the end of my shift, I entered an examination room carrying a patient chart. Ethan sat in the chair beside the window. The setting sun painted golden light across the room. He looked up immediately when I walked in. A small smile appeared. "Claire." "Mr. Romano." His smile widened slightly. "We have discussed this." I sighed. "Ethan." "Much better." I tried not to smile back. Failed. For a few minutes, we discussed ordinary medical questions. Then something unexpected happened. Ethan started asking about me. Not polite questions. Real ones. "How long have you been a nurse?" 3 years. "Do you enjoy it?" I looked surprised. Most people ask whether it is difficult. Is it? Sometimes. He nodded thoughtfully. But that was not my question. The answer came naturally. Yes. I love it. Something in his expression softened. "I thought you might." Before I could respond, a call came through the hospital intercom. A patient in another wing needed assistance. I apologized and left the room. Nearly 40 minutes later, I finally returned. Ethan was still there. Waiting. Most patients would have left. He had not. As we walked through the hallway together, we passed an elderly man sitting alone in the waiting area. His clothes were worn. His hands trembled slightly. Earlier that day, I had learned he could not afford transportation home after treatment. Without thinking, I stopped. I reached into my purse and handed him enough money for a taxi. The elderly man's eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you. Please get home safely," I said. Then I continued walking. I barely thought about the interaction afterward. Helping people was part of who I was. Yet when I glanced beside me, Ethan had stopped moving. He was watching the elderly man climb into a taxi outside the hospital entrance. "What?" I asked. Ethan looked away from the window. For a moment, something unusual appeared in his eyes. Not admiration. Not surprise. Something deeper. "Nothing." I crossed my arms. "That is the second time you have said that." A quiet laugh escaped him. "Maybe because I do not know how to explain it." "Explain what?" Ethan studied me carefully. "Most people only notice what they can gain from someone." His voice remained calm. "You seem more interested in what you can give." The comment caught me off guard. Nobody had ever described me that way before. I looked down briefly. Embarrassed. "I am just doing what anyone should do." Ethan slowly shook his head. "No." His answer came without hesitation. "You are doing what very few people actually do." For several seconds, neither of us spoke. The busy hospital seemed strangely quiet around us. Then Ethan glanced at his watch and stood. "I should leave." I nodded. "Take care of yourself." Another small smile appeared. "You too, Claire." As he disappeared through the hospital doors, I watched him walk away beneath the fading evening light. What I did not realize was that Ethan Romano had just witnessed something that would change the course of both our lives. Because for the first time in many years, he had met someone who reminded him of the person he used to be. Sometimes a person changes your life long before you realize they are doing it. After Ethan's last visit, nearly a week passed without seeing him. The hospital remained as busy as ever. Patients arrived. Patients left. Long shifts blurred together beneath fluorescent lights and endless cups of coffee. Yet every time the emergency room doors opened, I found myself glancing up. Waiting. I told myself it was curiosity. Nothing more. Then on a Thursday afternoon, I walked into the hospital cafeteria and froze. Ethan sat alone near the window. Sunlight spilled across the table in front of him. A newspaper rested beside a half-finished coffee. He looked completely out of place among doctors, nurses, and visitors. Yet somehow he appeared perfectly comfortable. When he noticed me, a familiar smile appeared. "Claire." I stared at him. "What are you doing here?" Ethan glanced around thoughtfully. "Having lunch." "In a hospital?" "The coffee is surprisingly good." I laughed despite myself. "That is the most ridiculous thing I have heard all week." His smile widened. "Then I am glad I could contribute." Before I knew it, I was sitting across from him. We talked for nearly 30 minutes. Nothing important. Everything important. Favorite books. Childhood memories. The best pizza in Manhattan. Ordinary conversations that somehow felt extraordinary. For the first time, I saw pieces of the man behind the expensive suits and careful expressions. Ethan was intelligent. Funny in a dry, unexpected way. Observant. He remembered small details most people forgot. When my lunch break ended, I stood reluctantly. "I should get back to work." Ethan nodded. "Of course." As I turned to leave, he asked a question. "Do you ever take a day off?" "Occasionally." "Good. Why?" His eyes held mine for a second. "Because people who spend their lives taking care of everyone else deserve someone to take care of them too." The comment stayed with me for the rest of the day. A few nights later, my shift ended just before midnight. Rain fell softly across Manhattan. The city glowed beneath reflections of red taillights and neon signs. On my way home, I stopped at a small grocery store. Outside the entrance, an elderly woman struggled with several heavy bags. Without thinking, I walked over. "Let me help you." She smiled gratefully. Together we carried the bags several blocks to her apartment building. By the time I finished, I was running late. Again, I barely thought about it. Helping people was simply part of who I was. What I did not know was that someone had witnessed the entire thing. The following afternoon, I arrived at the hospital and found a small package waiting at the nurse's station. Confused, I opened it. Inside sat a brand new pair of walking shoes. Comfortable. Practical. Attached was a handwritten note. For all the miles you spent helping everyone else. No signature. None was necessary. I immediately recognized the handwriting. My heart did something strange. Something unfamiliar. Later that evening, I found Ethan standing outside the hospital entrance. "You bought me shoes?" I asked. He looked entirely unapologetic. "You needed better ones." "How would you know that?" "Because the pair you wear is falling apart." I stared at him in disbelief. "You noticed my shoes?" Ethan shrugged. "I notice a lot of things." For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Traffic moved behind him. Rain clouds drifted across the darkening sky. Then I realized something that made my pulse quicken unexpectedly. Ethan Romano was not returning because he needed medical care. He was returning because he genuinely cared what happened to me. And for the first time, I was beginning to care what happened to him too. The truth rarely arrives all at once. Sometimes it appears in small pieces until suddenly you can no longer ignore it. A few days after Ethan gave me the shoes, life settled into a strange rhythm. He no longer invented medical reasons to visit the hospital. Instead, he appeared at the end of my shifts with coffee or a simple question about my day. Somehow those brief conversations became the part of my day I looked forward to most. One Saturday afternoon, my shift ended earlier than expected. As I stepped outside, I found Ethan waiting beside a black sedan. He held 2 cups of coffee. "You are becoming predictable," I said. "That sounds disappointing." "It is not." His smile appeared immediately. For a moment, neither of us looked away. Then he handed me the coffee. "Walk with me?" We spent the next hour wandering through a small neighborhood several blocks from the hospital. The conversation flowed easily. Books. Music. Childhood memories. Future dreams. Topics that somehow felt more important because they were shared with him. Eventually we stopped near a community center I had visited before during volunteer events. Children ran across a basketball court while families gathered nearby. Ethan became unusually quiet. I noticed several people greeting him as we approached. Teachers. Parents. Volunteers. Their smiles seemed genuine. Familiar. One elderly woman even hugged him. I looked at Ethan with surprise. "You know everyone here?" He glanced toward the building. "Not everyone. Enough that they seem happy to see you." A complicated expression crossed his face. Before he could answer, a young boy ran toward him carrying a science project. "Mr. Romano." Ethan immediately crouched to the child's level. "Let me see." For the next several minutes, the boy enthusiastically explained every detail. Ethan listened carefully. Patiently. Like nothing else in the world mattered. When the boy finally left, I stared at him. "You funded this place, did you not?" Ethan looked away. That was answer enough. I slowly turned toward the building. New computers. Educational programs. After-school activities. Everything suddenly made sense. "How many?" I asked quietly. "How many what?" "Community centers." He hesitated. "A few." "Ethan." A reluctant smile appeared. 7. I blinked. 7? And some scholarship programs. For several seconds, I could not speak. This did not fit the image I had created in my mind. Wealthy, yes. Successful, certainly. But this level of generosity felt different. Personal. Intentional. As if he was trying to fix something invisible. Later, as the sun began setting, we sat on a bench overlooking the playground. Golden light painted everything in warm colors. Children laughed in the distance. Ethan remained silent for a long moment. Then he spoke. When I was 12, my family could not afford school supplies. His voice was calm. A stranger paid for them. I listened carefully. I never forgot that. The simplicity of the story affected me more than any grand speech could have. Suddenly I understood. This was not charity. It was gratitude. A promise made long ago. I looked at Ethan differently after that. Not because I learned he helped people. Because I finally saw why. As darkness settled across the city, we stood to leave. Before reaching the car, I noticed two men across the street watching Ethan. Their expressions immediately changed when he looked their way. Respect. Caution. Something else I could not quite identify. A small uneasy feeling settled inside me. For the first time, I realized there might be parts of Ethan Romano's life I still knew absolutely nothing about. The moment you discover who someone really is, you also discover who you are willing to become for them. The uneasy feeling I carried home after visiting the community center refused to disappear. For days, small details replayed in my mind. The way people reacted when Ethan entered a room. The respect in their voices. The caution in their eyes. The expensive security vehicles that occasionally appeared nearby. None of it matched the man who bought comfortable shoes because he noticed mine were worn out. One rainy evening, I finished a late shift and stopped at a grocery store before heading home. While waiting in line, I noticed a magazine near the register. A photograph on the cover immediately caught my attention. My heart stopped. Ethan stared back at me from the front page. The headline beneath his picture felt unreal. It described him as one of the most influential and feared figures in New York's business world. Several articles referenced his enormous power, his private empire, and the rumors that followed him everywhere. For a moment, the noise of the store disappeared. I bought the magazine and walked home in silence. That night, I read every page. Then I read them again. Some stories praised him. Others criticized him. Many seemed designed to make him appear larger than life. Yet none of them resembled the man I knew. None of them mentioned the community centers. The scholarships. The quiet acts of generosity. The boy with the science project. The elderly woman who hugged him. I barely slept. The next afternoon, Ethan texted and asked if I wanted coffee after work. I almost said no. Instead, I agreed. We met at a small cafe overlooking the river. Ethan arrived first. He smiled when he saw me walking toward the table. The smile faded almost immediately. He knew something was wrong. Claire. I sat down slowly. The magazine rested inside my bag. Why didn't you tell me? His expression became very still. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then he glanced toward the river. Tell you what? I removed the magazine and placed it on the table. Ethan looked at the cover. No surprise appeared on his face. Only resignation. That, I said quietly. The wind moved across the water between us. People walked past carrying coffee and shopping bags. The world continued moving while mine seemed frozen. I was going to tell you, Ethan said. When? When I thought you knew me well enough to decide for yourself. I looked down. Part of me felt hurt. Another part understood exactly why he had waited. Is any of it true? I asked. Ethan considered the question carefully. Some of it. And the rest? A faint sadness entered his eyes. The rest is what people assume when they stop looking for the truth. His answer should not have comforted me. Somehow it did. We sat in silence for a long moment. Then Ethan leaned forward slightly. Claire, I never lied to you about who I am. His voice remained calm. Honest. I only hoped you would meet me before you met my reputation. I stared at him across the table. The powerful man described in those articles. the man who funded schools. The man who remembered my shoes. For the first time, I understood that both versions were real. And deciding what that meant for us suddenly became the most difficult choice I had ever faced. The people we trust the most are often the ones who finally tell us the truth we have been avoiding. After our conversation by the river, I did not see Ethan for several days. He did not call. He did not text. He did not appear outside the hospital with coffee or questions about my day. Part of me was relieved. Another part missed him more than I wanted to admit. The silence gave me time to think. Time to separate rumors from reality. Time to decide whether I was afraid of Ethan or simply afraid of what he meant to me. Late one evening, after finishing a particularly exhausting shift, I stepped outside the hospital and found a familiar black sedan waiting across the street. My heart reacted before my mind did. Ethan stood beside the car. His hands rested in his coat pockets. His expression was calm, but there was something different in his eyes. Something uncertain. For the first time since meeting him, he looked like a man who did not know what would happen next. I slowly walked toward him. Neither of us spoke immediately. The city moved around us. Traffic lights changed. People hurried along sidewalks. Yet everything felt strangely distant. Finally, Ethan broke the silence. "Would you come with me?" I hesitated for only a second. "Where?" "Somewhere important." 20 minutes later, the car stopped outside a modest apartment building in Brooklyn. It was not what I expected. No luxury. No security gates. No signs of wealth. Just an aging brick building standing quietly beneath streetlights. Ethan led me upstairs to a small apartment. The moment we entered, I understood. Photographs covered the walls. Family pictures. School pictures. Old memories frozen in time. A much younger version of Ethan appeared in nearly every frame. Thin. Serious. Determined. He walked toward a photograph sitting alone on a shelf. Then he handed it to me. A woman smiled back from the picture. Her eyes looked remarkably like his. "My mother," he said quietly. I studied the photograph. "She looks kind." Ethan smiled faintly. "She was." We sat together in the small living room. The apartment felt untouched by time. Almost sacred. For several moments, Ethan remained silent. Then he began talking. Not about power. Not about business. Not about reputation. About childhood. About growing up in poverty. About watching his mother work multiple jobs to keep food on the table. About the fear of losing everything. His voice never trembled. Yet every word carried weight. When she died, I was 19. The room became very still. I promised myself I would never be powerless again. I listened without interrupting. Ethan stared at the photograph in his hands. "I spent years building a life where nobody could ever take anything from me." A sad smile appeared. "The problem is that somewhere along the way, I stopped recognizing myself." My chest tightened. Because for the first time I could see the truth. Not the headlines. Not the rumors. The truth. Ethan Romano was not driven by greed. He was driven by fear. Fear of returning to the life he escaped. Fear of losing people he loved. Fear of becoming helpless again. When he finally looked at me, the walls he normally carried seemed gone. "I never wanted you to meet the version of me everyone talks about." His voice was barely above a whisper. "I wanted you to meet the person my mother hoped I would become." Tears filled my eyes before I could stop them. And sitting beside him in that small apartment filled with memories, I realized I was no longer trying to decide whether I could trust Ethan Romano. I was trying to decide what to do with the fact that I already did. The people we love become our greatest strength and our greatest fear at the exact same time. After the night Ethan showed me the apartment where he grew up, something shifted between us. The uncertainty that had followed us for weeks slowly disappeared. We no longer needed careful conversations or polite distance. Trust had arrived quietly, and once it did, everything felt different. For the first time since we met, I stopped wondering who Ethan Romano really was. I already knew. A few days later, life returned to its normal rhythm. I worked long shifts at the hospital. Ethan continued managing the enormous responsibilities that surrounded his world. Yet somehow we always found time for each other. A morning coffee. A late-night phone call. A short walk through the city after work. The small moments became the important ones. Then everything changed on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. I had just finished helping a patient when one of the hospital administrators approached me. His expression looked unusually serious. "Claire, there are two gentlemen asking for you in the lobby." Confused, I thanked him and headed downstairs. The moment I entered the lobby, I recognized neither man. Both wore expensive suits. Both appeared professional. Yet something about them immediately felt wrong. Not threatening. Calculated. One of them smiled politely. "Miss Bennett?" "Yes?" He handed me an envelope. This was requested by a mutual acquaintance. Before I could ask another question, both men turned and left. I stared after them. Then I opened the envelope. Inside was a newspaper clipping. Nothing more. My stomach tightened instantly. The article contained my photograph beside Ethan's. The headline speculated about our relationship and suggested that people close to Ethan possessed unusual influence over his future decisions. The words themselves were harmless. The implication was not. For the first time, I understood something Ethan had probably known from the beginning. Being connected to him meant becoming visible to people I would never normally encounter. That evening, I sat alone in my apartment staring at the clipping. The longer I looked at it, the worse I felt. Ethan had spent months protecting me from worries I barely understood. Meanwhile, I had become another vulnerability in his life. Another person others could potentially use to pressure him. My phone rang. "Ethan." I answered immediately. "Hello." His voice softened. "You sound upset." I closed my eyes. Of course he noticed. "Can we meet?" An hour later, we sat on a quiet bench overlooking the river. Manhattan glittered across the water. Ethan listened silently while I explained everything. When I finished, he remained calm. Too calm. That alone told me how serious the situation really was. Finally, I looked at him. "This is because of me." "No." His answer came instantly. "It is because of me." "Ethan." He shook his head. "Claire, none of this is your fault." But I could already see the truth. Every difficult choice he made now carried consequences beyond himself. And I hated it. More than I expected. The silence stretched between us. Then a painful realization settled into my chest. If staying close to Ethan created problems for him, then maybe caring about him was not enough. Maybe protecting him required something far more difficult. Later that night, after returning home, I stood by my window looking out across the city. Tears filled my eyes. Because for the first time since meeting Ethan Romano, I began considering the one decision I never thought I would make. Walking away from the man I loved before his world found a way to hurt him because of me. The hardest goodbyes are the ones spoken for love instead of anger. For 3 days after finding the newspaper clipping, I avoided Ethan. I answered his messages with short replies. I declined invitations. I buried myself in extra shifts at the hospital. Every decision felt wrong. Every hour felt heavier than the one before. Yet I kept telling myself the same thing. If I truly cared about Ethan, I could not become another burden he was forced to carry. Late Friday evening, my shift finally ended. Rain fell softly across Manhattan. The city lights blurred against wet streets. As I stepped outside the hospital, I saw him waiting. Ethan stood beneath a street lamp, hands in his coat pockets, looking exactly where I knew he would be. My heart broke a little at the sight of him. He crossed the street immediately. Claire. I tried to smile. Failed. Ethan studied my face for several seconds. Talk to me. The concern in his voice only made this harder. We walked together to a small park nearby. The benches glistened with rainwater. Trees swayed gently in the evening wind. Finally, I stopped walking. This cannot continue. Ethan became very still. What cannot continue? I looked away because meeting his eyes felt impossible. Us. The word hung between us. Heavy. Painful. Unreal. For a moment neither of us moved. Then Ethan spoke quietly. Do not do that. I am serious. So am I. I forced myself to continue. Your life is complicated. Mine is not. People are already paying attention. They are already talking. If things become worse. Ethan interrupted gently. Nothing is going to happen. You do not know that. I do. His confidence should have reassured me. Instead, it made everything harder. Because I could hear how determined he was to protect me. And that was exactly the problem. Tears filled my eyes. I never wanted you sacrificing pieces of your life because of me. Ethan stared at me. Then something changed in his expression. Understanding. Not agreement. Understanding. You think you are protecting me. I could not answer. Because he was right. A long silence followed. Rain tapped softly against leaves overhead. Finally, Ethan looked toward the skyline. Do you know what I spent most of my life chasing? His voice remained calm. Control. I listened quietly. Enough money. Enough influence. Enough power that nothing could ever be taken away again. He laughed softly. There was no humor in the sound. Then I met you. My chest tightened painfully. Ethan turned back toward me. Claire, for the first time in years, I stopped measuring my life by what I owned. His eyes held mine. I started measuring it by who I became when I was with you. Tears slipped down my cheeks. That is exactly why this hurts. Ethan closed his eyes briefly. Then he nodded. Slowly. Sadly. The expression on his face shattered me. Because he was letting me make my own choice even though it was breaking his heart. We stood there for several moments. Two people trying desperately to do the right thing and failing to agree on what that was. Finally, I whispered goodbye. Then I walked away. Every step felt impossible. I expected him to stop me. He did not. I expected him to call my name. He did not. By the time I reached my apartment, I was crying openly. What I did not know was that while I sat alone questioning everything, Ethan was making a decision of his own. A decision that would cost him more than anything he had ever sacrificed before. Because losing me was the one thing he had finally realized he could not survive. Sometimes love is not proven by what a person keeps. Sometimes it is proven by what they are willing to let go. 3 weeks passed after the night I walked away from Ethan. 3 of the longest weeks of my life. I threw myself into work. Extra shifts. Extra patience. Extra responsibilities. Anything to avoid thinking about him. Nothing worked. Every hallway reminded me of him. Every cup of coffee reminded me of him. Every quiet moment belonged to him. Yet Ethan never called. Never texted. Never appeared outside the hospital. The silence hurt more than I expected. Then one Monday morning, everything changed. I arrived at work and found the hospital buzzing with unusual excitement. Nurses whispered in small groups. Doctors discussed something they had seen on the news. Curious, I glanced toward a television mounted in the waiting area. My breath caught instantly. Ethan's face appeared on the screen. A reporter discussed a major announcement involving several companies, foundations, and charitable organizations connected to him. I listened carefully. Piece by piece, the story unfolded. Ethan had stepped away from several powerful positions. He had transferred enormous resources into educational programs, community projects, and public health initiatives. Millions of dollars were being redirected toward helping families, schools, and hospitals. The reporter called it unexpected, historic, unprecedented. I only heard one thing. Ethan had changed the direction of his entire future. My hands trembled. That evening, unable to ignore the feeling in my chest any longer, I went to the community center where we had spent that afternoon together months before. Children still played basketball outside. Parents still gathered near the entrance. Everything looked the same. Until I saw him. Ethan stood alone near the playground. The setting sun painted the sky gold behind him. For a moment neither of us moved. Then he smiled. The same smile that had first appeared in a hospital examination room. Warm. Quiet. Real. I walked toward him slowly. You did all that? His expression softened. Some of it needed to happen anyway. I shook my head. That is not an answer. Ethan laughed quietly. No. It is not. The evening breeze moved gently around us. Finally I asked the question that had lived inside my heart for weeks. Why? Ethan looked toward the children playing nearby. When he answered, his voice carried no hesitation. Because you reminded me who I wanted to be. Tears filled my eyes. Ethan. He turned toward me completely. Claire, I spent years building a life that protected me from losing things. His gaze never left mine. Then I met someone worth losing things for. My heart shattered and healed at the same time. For several seconds neither of us spoke. We did not need to. The answer had already been given. The choice had already been made. Finally I stepped closer. I was never trying to leave because I stopped loving you. A smile touched his face. I know. The city lights slowly began appearing beyond the horizon. Children laughed. The evening settled around us. And for the first time since the night we met, there was no fear between us. No uncertainty. No walls. Only two people who had changed each other forever. Ethan gently took my hand. Not as a promise of perfection. Not as a promise that life would always be easy. But as a promise that whatever came next, we would face it together. And standing there beside the man everyone else thought they understood, I finally realized something simple. The greatest thing Ethan Romano ever sacrificed was not power. It was the version of himself he no longer wanted to be.